In 1940, the German Wehrmacht was the most mechanized army in the world. They had a specific vehicle for the role of the light transport, the Kübelwagen. Designed by Ferdinand Porsche and built by Volkswagen, the Kübelwagen was essentially a Beetle on steroids. It was lightweight, air-cooled, and rear-wheel drive. It was a good car. It was comfortable on roads. It was fuel efficient. German officers loved it. It looked military, with its ribbed metal sides, but it drove like a civilian sedan. Across the Atlantic, the US Army was looking for something different. They didn't want a car. They wanted a mechanical mule. They issued a challenge to American car companies: build a vehicle that weighs less than 1,300 pounds, can carry 600 pounds, has four-wheel drive, and can go anywhere a horse can go. The result was the Bantam reconnaissance car, the prototype of the Jeep. When German intelligence first saw pictures of this American invention, they were unimpressed. It looked crude. It had no doors. It had no roof. It was tiny, much smaller than the Kübelwagen. It looked like a toy. The German engineers analyzed the specs. They saw the heavy transmission needed for four-wheel drive and scoffed. Why add the weight? They asked. Rear-wheel drive is sufficient for a scout car. They believed the Americans were over-engineering the drivetrain while under-engineering the comfort. They saw the flat, vertical windshield and the lack of curves as a sign of hasty, cheap manufacturing. The Germans viewed their vehicles as specialized tools. The Kübelwagen was for officers and messengers. Motorcycles were for scouts. Trucks were for cargo. They didn't understand that the Americans were building a universal vehicle. They laughed at the little square car. They called it a bathtub on wheels. They didn't realize that this bathtub was about to wash them off the map. The genius of the Jeep wasn't in its looks, it was in its guts. The final design, standardized as the Willys MB and the identical Ford GPW, was a masterpiece of rugged simplicity. At its heart was the Go Devil engine. It was a four-cylinder engine that produced 60 horsepower. This doesn't sound like much, but the Jeep was light. The power-to-weight ratio was phenomenal. But the real secret was the torque and the transfer case. The Jeep had a dual-range transfer case. The driver could shift into low range and engage all four wheels. In low range, the Jeep could climb a 60-degree slope. It could pull a load 3 times its own weight. It could drive through mud that was axle deep. The frame was a simple steel ladder, tough and flexible. If the Jeep hit a ditch, the frame would twist and spring back rather than braking. The body was pure function. The flat fenders were designed to be tables for maps or lunch. The flat had folded up so the engine could be completely exposed for repair. The windshield folded flat so the Jeep could fit inside a glider or be stacked in a crate. There were no keys. A simple floor switch started it. Why have keys in a war zone? There were no doors. This allowed soldiers to jump in and out instantly during an ambush. It had grab handles on the side so that if it got stuck, which was rare, for men could physically lift it out of the mud. To the German engineers, who loved complex suspensions and precision machining, the Jeep was an affront. It was loose. It rattled. It leaked oil. But it never stopped. It was designed to be built by unskilled labor and fixed by anyone with a wrench. The Germans had built a military car. The Americans had built a motorized platform that could do anything. When the Jeep first appeared in North Africa in 1942, the German officers of the Afrika Korps treated it as a curiosity. They captured a few during the initial skirmishes. They looked at the tiny wheels. They looked at the cramped seats. Field Marshal Rommel, who used a massive Horch command car or a customized half-track, looked down at the little American vehicle. It seemed undignified. A German officer was expected to ride in something that projected authority. A Jeep projected utility. They mocked the lack of weather protection. The Americans will bake in the sun and freeze in the night, they said. They laughed at the suspension, which was stiff and bouncy. It rides like a cart, they noted. They compared it to their motorcycles with sidecars, the BMW R75. The motorcycle was fast and agile. The Jeep seemed like a slow, boxy compromise. They didn't understand the concept of the force multiplier. A German infantry unit moved at the speed of its slowest walker. An American infantry unit moved at the speed of its Jeeps. The Germans saw the Jeep as a scout car, a vehicle to go look at the enemy and come back. They didn't see it as a combat vehicle. They didn't expect the Americans to mount .50 caliber machine guns on them. They didn't expect them to tow anti-tank guns. They treated the Jeep with the same disdain they had for the amateur American soldiers. It was cheap, mass-produced junk. This mockery lasted exactly until the mud season began in Tunisia. When the rains came, the German motorcycles sank. The Kübelwagen spun their rear wheels helplessly in the slime. The heavy Horch staff cars bogged down to their chassis. But the Jeeps kept going. With four wheels churning, they buzzed past the stuck German columns, delivering ammo, evacuating wounded, and scouting positions. The laughter stopped when the Germans realized that the toy was the only thing moving on the battlefield. The most terrifying thing about the Jeep for the Germans wasn't its performance. It was its numbers. The United States built 640,000 Jeeps during the war. Germany built only 50,000 Kübelwagens. The disparity was 12-1. Jeeps were everywhere. They were delivered to the British, the Soviets, the Free French, and the Chinese. Every American infantry regiment had 150 Jeeps. They were used for everything. Commanders used them to visit the front lines personally, something German generals struggled to do as their cars broke down. Chaplains used them as mobile altars. Cooks used them to deliver hot food to foxholes. Signal Corps used them to lay wire, mounting a spool on the back and driving at 30 miles per hour. They were even used as power plants. A Jeep could be jacked up, the tire removed, and a belt attached to the rim to run a generator, a saw, or a water pump. The Jeep was the WD-40 of the war. It solved every problem. The German logistics were rigid. They had specific vehicles for specific tasks. If the ambulance truck was destroyed, they had no ambulance. The Americans just grabbed a Jeep, threw a stretcher across the back seats, and they had an ambulance. If they needed to tow a gun, they grabbed a Jeep. This flexibility gave the Allied armies a tempo that the Germans couldn't match. The Germans were always waiting for the right equipment to arrive. The Americans just used whatever Jeep was parked nearby. The logistics of ubiquities meant that the American army was never stuck. It was a swarm. And for the German soldier, seeing an endless stream of these little green bugs coming over every hill, it was a sign that they were fighting a hydra. The Jeep was the physical embodiment of American industrial power, simple, rugged, and available in infinite supply. The Germans viewed the Jeep as a transport vehicle. The Americans viewed it as a weapons platform. Early in the war, the U.S. Army needed a way to give its infantry mobile anti-tank firepower. The standard 37mm anti-tank gun was good, but towing it with a heavy truck was slow. They realized the Jeep was the perfect prime mover. The Jeep could tow the 900-pound 37mm gun with ease. It could carry the gun crew and a supply of ammunition. This created a new kind of unit, the anti-tank platoon. These platoons developed a tactic called shoot and scoot. A Jeep would race into a concealed position, drop the gun trail, and the crew would be ready to fire in seconds. They would engage a German tank or bunker, fire 5 or 6 rounds, then immediately hook the gun back up and speed away before the German artillery could zero in on them. The Jeep was fast and small, making it a very hard target to hit. German panzer crews were frustrated. They would see muzzle flashes from a hedge, fire a high-explosive round at it, and find nothing but tire tracks when the smoke cleared. The Jeep was also used as a self-propelled gun. Soldiers fabricated pedestal mounts and welded them to the floor of the Jeep in the back. They mounted .50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine guns or .30 caliber M1919s. A Jeep with a .50 cal was a fearsome weapon. It could shred German trucks, suppress infantry, and even damage light armored vehicles. These gun Jeeps were used for convoy escort and reconnaissance. They could punch way above their weight. The Germans had nothing like it. Their Kübelwagons were too flimsy to mount heavy weapons. The sight of a little bathtub speeding toward them, spitting .50 caliber bullets, was a terrifying shock to German infantry used to facing only rifles and mortars. Casualty evacuation is one of the hardest logistical problems in war. Standard army ambulances were converted panel trucks. They were heavy, rear-wheel drive, and had high centers of gravity. In the deep mud of Italy or the snow of the Ardennes, they got stuck constantly. Wounded soldiers were dying because they couldn't get to the aid stations fast enough. The medics turned to the Jeep. They modified them in the field. They welded metal racks onto the hood and across the back seats. A Jeep could carry 2 stretchers, one on the front, one on the back, and 2 walking wounded in the passenger seats. It looked precarious. The wounded soldiers were strapped to the outside of the vehicle, exposed to the elements. But the Jeep could get through. With its 4-wheel drive in low range, the Jeep ambulance could churn through knee-deep mud, climb rocky trails, and ford streams that stopped regular ambulances cold. The ride was rough, Jeeps had stiff suspension, but it was fast. Medics drove with one hand on the wheel, the other holding a plasma bottle aloft for the wounded man strapped to the hood. They drove under mortar fire. They drove at night without lights, guiding themselves by the flashes of artillery. The Jeep ambulance saved tens of thousands of lives. It reduced the time between wound and treatment, which is the critical factor in survival. For the German soldier lying wounded in the mud, waiting hours for a horse-drawn cart to pick him up, the sound of a Jeep ambulance buzzing by on the American side must have been a bitter reminder of the disparity in resources. The Jeep wasn't just a killing machine, it was a lifeline. While the Americans used the Jeep as a workhorse, the British turned it into a pirate ship. In the vast deserts of North Africa, the British Special Air Service, SAS, needed a vehicle for long-range raids behind German lines. They needed speed, range, and massive firepower. They took the standard Willys Jeep and stripped it down even further. They removed the windshield, the glass would reflect the sun and give away their position. They removed the radiator grille slats to improve cooling in the desert heat. They added massive auxiliary fuel tanks and sand channels to get unstuck. And they armed them to the teeth. A typical SAS Jeep carried twin-mounted Vickers K machine guns, taken from aircraft, for the passenger, another Vickers K for the driver, and sometimes a .50 cal in the back. These Jeeps were bristling with guns. A squadron of them could unleash more firepower than an infantry battalion. They looked like something out of Mad Maximum. The crews wore Arab keffiyehs and beards. They would raid German airfields at night. They would drive onto the tarmac in a V formation, roaring at full speed, all guns blazing. They would shred parked German aircraft, blow up fuel dumps, and shoot up the barracks, then disappear back into the desert darkness before the Germans knew what hit them. The Germans called them the Desert Ghosts. They were terrified of them. Field Marshal Rommel had to divert thousands of troops to guard his rear areas, tying up forces that were desperately needed at the front. The SAS proved that the Jeep wasn't just a support vehicle. In the right hands, it was a strategic weapon that could paralyze an entire theater of war. The ubiquity of the Jeep meant that it became a symbol of the democratic nature of the American Army. It was the only vehicle that was driven by everyone, from the lowest private to the highest general. There is a famous series of photos showing a Catholic chaplain using the hood of a Jeep as an altar. Soldiers are kneeling in a muddy field in Normandy, receiving communion. The Jeep, covered in mud, is the center of this holy moment. It showed that the church came to the soldiers, riding in the same vehicle they used. At the other end of the spectrum, generals like Eisenhower, George Patton, and Omar Bradley were rarely seen in anything else. German generals rode in chauffeur-driven Mercedes or Horch limousines, separated from their men by glass partitions and luxury. American generals drove themselves, or sat in the front seat next to their driver. They were exposed to the same weather and the same dust as the infantry. When General Patton wanted to inspire his troops, he didn't stand on a balcony. He stood in the back of a Jeep, wearing his ivory-handled pistols, and gave a speech while his driver drove slowly past the ranks. The Jeep was a leveling device. It connected the commanders to the reality of the front line. Eisenhower later famously listed the Jeep as one of the 3 tools that won the war, along with the C-47 transport plane and the landing craft. It wasn't just a machine. It was a cultural icon that represented the American philosophy of war, practical, egalitarian, and relentlessly forward-moving. The Germans mocked it as undignified. The Americans embraced it as essential. The tide of war turned in 1944 and 1945, a strange phenomenon began to appear on the German side of the lines. German units were abandoning their own vehicles, their Kübelwagons, their Opels, their Horches, in favor of captured American Jeeps. The Jeep had become the ultimate war trophy for a German soldier. It started in North Africa and Italy. When a German unit overran an American position, the first thing they looked for was food, cigarettes, and jeeps. They would quickly paint a large black and white Balkenkreuz, German cross, over the white American star on the hood. Why did they prefer the enemy's vehicle? Reliability. By late in the war, German manufacturing quality had plummeted. Spare parts for German vehicles were non-existent. Synthetic oil and rubber were scarce. German vehicles were breaking down constantly. The captured jeeps, however, just kept running. They were tough. They could handle the terrible fuel that the Germans were forced to use. And if something broke, they were easy to fix with basic tools. German officers, who had once mocked the undignified little car, now fought over who got to drive the captured jeeps. It was a status symbol of practical survival. There were entire German reconnaissance units equipped almost exclusively with captured jeeps. The irony was bitter. The master race was driving to battle in the degenerate American machine because their own superior engineering had failed the test of total war. The ultimate compliment to the jeep's design paid by the enemy was that they stole it every chance they got. The final push into Germany required crossing a series of massive rivers, the Seine, the Meuse, and finally, the Rhine. The retreating Germans blew every bridge. The American advance should have stopped. But the army engineers brought up their floating pontoon bridges and treadway bridges. And the first vehicle across every new bridge was always a jeep. The jeep was light enough to cross a temporary bridge before it was fully secured for heavy tanks. Commanders would race across in jeeps to establish a bridgehead on the far side, directing the flow of traffic. The jeep's light weight meant it could also be ferried across in small boats or carried by amphibious DUKWs before the bridges were even built. There was even a kit developed to make the jeep itself amphibious, the SEAP GPA, though it was less successful than the standard jeep. The image of a column of jeeps, loaded with supplies and soldiers, bouncing across a swaying pontoon bridge over the Rhine, became a symbol of the relentless American advance. The Germans couldn't stop the flow. They would blow a bridge, and hours later, the jeeps were buzzing across the river again. The jeep's ability to traverse difficult terrain meant that once across the river, it didn't need to stay on the roads, which were often mined or zeroed in by German artillery. It could fan out into the fields and forests, bypassing German strongpoints and maintaining the momentum of the attack. The Rhine, the historic barrier of Germany, was breached by a swarm of four-wheel drive gnats. How did America get 640,000 jeeps to the battlefields around the world? They didn't ship them fully assembled. That would have wasted massive amounts of cargo space on ships. They shipped them in boxes. It was a triumph of logistical packaging. At the Willys Overland factory in Toledo, Ohio, jeeps were taken right off the assembly line and partially disassembled. The wheels were taken off. The windshield was folded flat. The steering wheel was removed. The seats were collapsed. The entire vehicle was coated in a heavy layer of preservative grease, known as Cosmoline, to protect it from the salt air during the ocean voyage. Then, it was packed into a wooden crate that was perfectly sized to fit into the hold of a Liberty ship. These crates could be stacked 5 or 6 high. A single cargo ship could carry hundreds of jeeps. When the crates arrived at a port in England, France, or a Pacific island, they were offloaded. 2 mechanics with basic tools could knock the crate apart, wipe off the grease, bolt the wheels and steering wheel back on, add gas and oil, and drive the Jeep away in minutes. This knockdown shipping method allowed the US to flood the world with transport. While German factories were being bombed into rubble, American factories were boxing up armies and shipping them across the ocean. The German logistical nightmare of trying to move complex, fully assembled vehicles by rail was contrasted with the American logistical miracle of shipping an entire motor pool in crates. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world looked different. Europe was in ruins. The great German war machine was crushed. And parked on every street corner in Berlin, Paris, Rome, and Tokyo was a little green car with a white star on the hood. The Willys MB Jeep had become the universal symbol of liberation. General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. It was a bold statement, considering the atomic bomb, the B-29, and the Essex-class carrier. But Marshall was right. Those other weapons won battles. The Jeep won the campaign. It was the connective tissue of the Allied war effort. It moved the people, the information, and the supplies that made the grand strategy possible. It proved that in a total war, the most valuable machine is not the one with the biggest gun or the thickest armor. It's the one that works, every time, everywhere, for everyone. The German officers who had laughed at the bathtub on wheels in 1942 had learned a hard lesson in pragmatism. They had bet on complexity and specialization. The Americans had bet on simplicity and universality. And the simple machine had inherited the earth. The Jeep wasn't just a car. It was a declaration of a new kind of power, a power built not on elite warriors, but on the mass production of rugged capability. It was the car that won the war.